For me, it's the morning, but I'm going to wish everyone a good afternoon and a good evening. Welcome to the Rapoport-Albert Memorial Panel at the UAGS Conference on Hasidism and Haskalah. My name is Rubin, and I'm chairing the session. I'm in the final stages of completing a PhD that was begun at Professor Rapoport-Albert's invitation and under her tutelage. And I'm also an editor and research writer at Habad.org. I'm going to first say a few words about our presenters and the order of proceedings. And then I also want to say a few words about Ada in tribute to her. So unfortunately, our colleagues Agata Paloch and Jonathan Meyer have had to withdraw from the session. So we're left with the people that you see here: Wojciech, Tworek, Naftali Loewenthal, Kahn, and Sonya Yampolskaya. Lily and Sonya will be presenting together. So we have 3 presentations. We'll allocate 20 minutes to each, and each one will be followed by another 10 minutes for discussion. We won't take the time too seriously because we have a lot of extra time, but I don't think we'll take up all the time allocated originally for the session. Hopefully we'll finish a good half an hour or so early. Okay, so some thoughts in tribute to my teacher, Professor Rapoport-Albert, and in relation to the broader theme of the conference, Hasidism and Haskalah. It's now increasingly acknowledged that the academic study of Hasidism bears the imprint of the Maskilic ideological legacy. Consciously or unconsciously, and whether to a greater degree or a less degree, this can manifest itself in an undercurrent of polemic and superciliousness towards the subject of study that inevitably undermines the scholarly project. To my mind, Ada Rapoport-Albert modeled a methodological stance that enabled her to engage in field-changing critical research that always remained well above any such polemic or superciliousness. One element of this methodological stance was her consistent historicization of historiography itself. Another, that she was extremely judicious, but never judgmental. Perhaps most importantly, she was curious in the sort of way that genuinely overcomes the limits of one's preconceptions. It was this curiosity that led her to look anew at Hasidism and to rewrite narratives that had previously been axiomatic both among members of Hasidic communities and among scholars who study Hasidism academically. Her project was never a simplistic debunking, but always a sensitive and robust parsing of blurred genres and accrued textual layers in order to more clearly see the underlying historical bedrock. So hopefully those thoughts will provide a fitting frame for the presentations to come, beginning with that of Wojciech Tworek, who is assistant professor at the Tau Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Wrocław. He wrote his doctoral dissertation at UCL under Ada Rapoport-Albert's supervision. And his first book, Eternity Now, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of the Adi and Temporality, examines the teachings of the first Chabad Rebbe. His second book, forthcoming this autumn, is the annotated Polish edition of the autobiography of Nathan Steinhardt, and his current research project concerns Habad in interwar Poland. His presentation today is titled Habad Hasidism Through the Lens of Ada Rapoport-Albert's Research Notes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Eli, for this introduction. And let me just share my screen with you. Hopefully that's gonna work properly. Just a sec. Okie dokes, does that work? Is it okay? Can you see? Okay, brilliant.
Yeah, we can
okay, brilliant. So again, once again, thank you very much for having me here. It's truly an honor and pleasure to present at a panel that celebrates Ada's scholarship. And as you all probably know, Ada's research interests were broad and included Kabbalah, Sabbatism, Frankism, Hasidism, women's history, and more. But one of her main research interests was Chabad Hasidism, and her articles on Chabad hagiography or on the changing role of women in Habad are definitely a must-read for anyone interested in Hasidic history and culture. However, books and articles were just one of many ways actually, in which Ada communicated her expertise. And in the course of her career, Ada delivered dozens of talks and lectures, most of which have never been either published or recorded. But fortunately, not all of them are lost. And in my talk, I'll provide a brief overview of the collection of Ada's research notes and papers, which is currently held in the library of the Tobi Department of Jewish Studies in Wrocław. And taking Chabad Messianism as a small case study, I'll consider the usability of this collection for both Ada's intellectual biography and for the future research of Hasidism. So let me begin with giving you a very brief intro to the collection itself. So several years ago, Ada decided that after her passing, her work in library should be donated to the Tobi department in Wrocław. And in the summer of 2020, with a huge help from Ada's children, the books arrived in Wrocław, and together with them, several dozens of boxes containing Ada's papers. The books are a different story, and I won't be talking about them now. I'll only note that most of them have been processed by now, and they are available for readers. So if any of you is interested in using them, in using this collection, please feel free to contact me or our departmental librarian. But back to the papers. So the boxes with papers are slowly processed as we speak, and it will take some time before they are available for readers, before they are catalogued and made available for readers. But at this stage, I can tell you that they include materials roughly of several sorts. So first of all, we've got lecture notes, and I'll focus on them today. These include mostly handwritten notes to Ada's open lectures and conference talks from at least mid-80s until 2019. Only a few oldest papers are typed from the beginning to the end, and the vast majority are handwritten in Hebrew, even if the lecture was delivered in English, and they often contain only major points of the talk, and often accompanied by bits and pieces of primary sources pasted or pinned onto the paper. In addition, some folders include multiple drafts of Ada's articles and authored or edited books. So for example, there's a full folder that contains papers and email printouts related to the latest volume of the Polin journal, which Ada co-edited. The third group of materials, which I will also refer to today, are index cards. So there are 11 boxes of Ada's index cards in the collection, and they're grouped thematically. So there's a box titled Habad, Wrocław, early Hasidism, asceticism, and so on. These index cards are not dated. However, keywords used in some of them suggest that at least some of them were created by Ada when she was writing her doctoral dissertation, which is submitted in 1974. And other probably were used for her to her article about Chabad hagiography with footnotes. Again, I'll go back to them in a second. A big part of the collection consists of offprints of articles or other scholars, which Ada either received by post or printed out from PDFs, and she sorted them alphabetically. Fortunately or unfortunately, most of these papers are not annotated, but the collection itself shows the sort of academic circle in which Ada functioned in her professional life on a daily basis. The next group consists of, I throw in here like all different types of stuff, but we have here administrative papers, administrative documents related to her work at UCL and to her service for the Jewish Historical Society of England, as well as some other types of service to profession. exam forms, communication with editors, recommendations, and assorted paperwork. There are some letters and emails from other scholars, and finally there are assorted ephemeral materials related to Ada's research. Clipping of articles on Joseph Weiss and Gershom Scholem, for example, or Habad and anti-Habad leaflets of various provenance. Again, that's the third type of material that we'll go back to later on. So all these documents shed light on Ada's work, her lifelong interests, and her development as a scholar beyond what we can learn from her published work. Many lectures served Ada to present ideas which at some point she planned to publish. For example, a significant portion of both index cards and lecture notes are materials for her book on asceticism and gender in Jewish traditions, which unfortunately was never published. Many papers and notes concern Hasidism, and these include plenty of materials on Chabad Hasidism, and I will use the remaining time, my remaining time to focus on them. And they're important for several reasons. So first of all, they show breadth of Ada's expertise and her thinking about Chabad in general, beyond the question of women in Chabad or Chabad historiography and so on. Second of all, they show Ada's keen interest in the latest developments in the contemporary Chabad and Hasidic community. Third, they demonstrate her attentiveness to various ephemeral and untypical sources, which may give insight into contemporary Hasidic culture. And finally, I believe that scholars and students of Chabad may find in Ada's notes a trove of information which really help to better understand the 20th century history and culture of the Hasidic movement. So let's take for instance the controversial issue of Chabad messianism. So it seems that to Ada, at least judging from her index cards, the Chabad messianism was at first primarily an issue related to the leadership and thought of the sixth Chabad Rebbe, Yosef Yitzhak Schneerson. So the index cards in the box entitled Chabad are not dated, but they were apparently created before 1994 because they refer to Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who died that year, as Hanochachi, or the present Rebbe. Interestingly, while the section Messianism, the present Rebbe, contains 3 cards only, the section devoted to the Messianic idea in the thought of the sixth Rebbe contains around 20 cards. These cards contain references, sometimes with quotations, to mystical discourses, to Ma'amarim, to informal talks, to Sichot, by Yosef Yitzhak, to his letters, and to the Chabad press published under his auspices in the United States. The notes on Yosef Yitzhak's messianism focus on the 1940s, that is on the time when the when Yosef Yitzhak used various media to call American Jews to repent and expedite the advent of the Messiah. Some notes, however, point to Schneerson's pre-war talks as well, in which he grappled with messianism. Another returned later to this idea, and in her 2017 talk she gave in Toronto, she framed messianism as one of the 3 major aspects of the modernization of Chabad that was initiated by Yosef Yitzhak Schneerson during his stay in interwar Poland. 2 other aspects were the inclusion of women and the outreach activities. And in this talk, Ada explored the Hasidic idea of messianism, understood as the disclosure and popularization of Chabad esoteric teachings. She traced the root of this concept back to Yosef Yitzhak's father, the Rebbe Shalom Dovber, and explained it against the background of his experience of living in the times of dramatic social, political, and cultural changes in Russia. Messianism was, as Ada argued, Shalom Dovber's reaction to the threats of the Tsarist policies on the one hand, and to the rise of Jewish radical politics on the other. And then his son, Yosef Yitzhak, led Chabad in even more difficult times, which involved anti-religious persecution in the Soviet Union, rampant secularization in the United States, and the rise of secular Zionist center in Palestine. In later years, these problems were overshadowed by the rise of the Nazis and the Holocaust. And Yosef Yitzhak, as Ada argued, reacted to this chain of events of catastrophic proportions by preaching a notion of acute apocalyptic messianism. And the intense messianism remained a central tenet of Chabad, also after Yosef Yitzhak's passing, when he was succeeded by his son-in-law, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And in her talk, Ada compared briefly the messianic strategies of the two last Chabad Rebbes. And she suggested that while Yosef Yitzhak's messianism was part of the process of the modernization of Chabad, his successor's messianism could be considered part of the process of post-modernization of Hasidism. And again, Ada never published a full-blown study on neither on Menachem Mendel Schneerson's messianism or Chabad and post-modernity. But still many documents testify to her avid interest in the Chabad messianism during the lifetime of the last Chabad Rebbe, and especially after his passing. Ada collected newspaper clippings, leaflets, pamphlets, and other more or less ephemeral prints concerning the messianic identity of the late Rebbe. She followed the controversies that ensued following the Rebbe's passing, both within and outside the Chabad community. And among her papers are, for example, pamphlets arguing for the belief in the resurrected Messiah in Judaism, a leaflet of the so-called Elohists, that is the Hasidim who argued for the divine character of the Rebbe, or copies or leaflets and advertisements from the Israeli press that denounced the Messianists, the Mashiachism, as heretics. And these controversies spilled out from the Hasidic community into the modern Orthodox world and into academia. One major controversy was related to the 2001 book by David Berger of the Yeshiva University called The Rebbe, the Messiah, and the Scandal of Orthodox Indifference. Another, no less fervent, ensued following the publication of the Rebbe's biography by Samuel Hillman and Menachem Friedman in 2010. And Ada followed both these controversies, starting from polemics in various Orthodox magazines, through the books themselves, to various scuffles in the Jewish blogosphere. Relatively few but fascinating documents in the collection pertain to the splits within the Chabad community. These include various press articles about the Messianists and non-Messianists, but also several documents produced by the internal opposition to the leadership of Chabad. And I had mentioned these controversies surrounding Chabad Messianism because I think they show something about Ada as a scholar as well. I began my discussion of Ada's grappling with Chabad Messianism by showing you her index cards from presumably 1980s. And you may have noticed that these cards refer to sources that are elitist by nature. The cards suggest that the key to understanding Chabad Messianism lies in the discourses and talks and letters of the sixth Rebbe. But the assorted materials in Ada's papers tell a very different story and testify to her openness to the variety of sources, including those that provide access to the voices of the rank and file of Hasidim, Hasidim as well. The sources like newspaper articles, blog entries, discussions on Hasidic forums, and so on. A fascinating document is a collection of weekly sermons by Shaul Shimon Deutsch, which, as many probably know, is, he's known for many things, but one of these things is the fact that he left the mainstream Chabad community in the mid-90s and created his own split of community in Borough Park called Anshei Liozna. And so when the Chabad mainstream was struggling with the question how to carry on without the Rebbe present, he actually proclaimed himself the next Habad, leader, next Habad Rebbe. And his sermons often refer to topical issues in Chabad and in the Hasidic community in general, from the activities of the Mashiachistim, of the Messianists, to, for example, the question of child abuse in Orthodox communities. So in general, they are an important commentary to the inner Chabad conflict over the theology and legacy of the Rebbe, as well as over the shape and future of the Chabad community in general. And one last fascinating thing that I want to show you is that it seems that Ada's interest in Chabad Messianism brought her back in a way to some topics that she had explored at much earlier stages of her career, and most importantly, the Wrocław Hasidism. So Ada's academic career in a way started with Wrocław. Her doctoral dissertation concerned Rabbi Nachman, after whose death his Hasidim famously decided not to appoint a new Rebbe and instead pledged their allegiance to their deceased leader. And this fact has been something fairly unique for Wrocław for many years. By then, Menachem Mendel Schneerson passed away in 1994, and his followers decided not to appoint a new leader of Chabad. And so a certain affinity arose between Wrocław and Chabad, and Ada set out to explore this issue. And already in 1996, she gave a talk entitled The Dead Hasidim, the Rehabilitation of Hasidic Circle Following the Death of the Messianic Leader. And the folder with multiple drafts of the talk contains also several drafts of a chapter from her 1974 dissertation, to which she ostensibly returned while writing this new piece. And like many of her talks, also this one began with a presentation of a long duration of Hasidic ideas. So the talk is on, it's 1996, the talk is on Messianism in Habad, 2 years after the Rebbe's passing. So it's surely a pressing and a controversial topic for the audience. And yet Ada began by showing the development of Chabad Messianism from the 5th to the 6th, all the way to the 7th Rebbe. And then she reached back to the materials from her doctoral dissertation. And conflicts and splits in the 19th century Wrocław community served her as a model for the attempts of various contemporary Chabad factions to fill the leadership gap and to make the Rebbe present in a way, both through his teachings and through the visits at his grave. The Wrocław Chabad affinities merited a more thorough analysis in Ada's later talk. In this paper, Atkarvut Breslev Habad, so Habad Wrocław rapprochement, I guess, Ada zoomed in on 12 phenomena which testify to the doctrinal and practical affinities between these two groups at present. These include not only the most obvious one, that is the lack of a living Rebbe, but also the proselytizing activities, the imperative to publish the esoteric teachings, non-apocalyptic messianism, or even the somewhat more positive approach towards non-Jews. And in some way, this paper comes full circle, because not only did Ada return to topics developed in her dissertation and now made very actual and very timely, but also by arguing on the closeness between Habad and Wrocław, Ada engaged in open polemics with her teacher, with Joseph Weiss, who famously defined Habad and Wrocław as opposite schools of Hasidism of mysticism and Hasidism of faith. And so, approaching to the end of my presentation, I'm very much aware of the fact that it has barely an introductory character, but I hope it sheds some light on Ada's research interest and her approach to Hasidism. And I have found among her papers a full transcript of a talk she gave at a semi-academic, semi-confessional colloquium in the 1990s. And the organizers suggested a particular title for her talk. I can't remember the exact wording she said, but I think it was something like Hasidism, disaster for the Jews, or good thing for the Jews, or good or bad for the Jews. And these are not categories that I can think in. I can't think of whether Hasidism is good or bad. I mean, I'm absolutely enthralled by it. I have been working from its literary traditions for many years. So what I shall try to do would really be expressed best by simply adding a question to the title, a question mark to the title that stands, The Legacy of Hasidism. And so Ada's papers and research notes show her enthrallment with Hasidism in many its incarnations, from its beginnings in the circle of Baal Shem Tov to the early 21st century. They show Ada's commitment to the study of Hasidic traditions, literary and otherwise. And finally, these papers show her inquisitiveness and critical thinking, in which a simple question mark put next to a word or a term could lead to a thorough and often paradigm-changing study. And a study free of value judgments and free of parochialisms. And Ada's critical eye was also turned towards her own work, as multiple revisions to her older papers show. And this could be a reason why so many brilliant papers have never ended up in print, despite some nudging emails from editors. So while processing these papers will take some time, as I said, I do encourage you to stay in touch, and when they're ready, do come to Wrocław, get in touch, and keep learning from Ada. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wojciech. That was an excellent, fascinating presentation. I just want to point out that the last quote that you had of the beginning of that talk is actually on YouTube. You can watch her giving that talk on YouTube. So, and that's also something that came to mind to me, just thinking about her attitude towards the study of Hasidism, that enthrallment and sense of curiosity that really underpinned everything. Okay, so the floor is open to some questions. I guess you can raise hands or put in the chat, and I guess Vitalai will unmute people who are raising their hand. Or am I able to do that? I don't know.
Tali is willing to ask the question. Maybe we could.
Tali?
Right. I want to say to Wojciech, thank you for a very, very beautiful paper, and very special seeing these images of Ada's filing system and notes and things like that. That's beautiful. Well, you see, it's not exactly a question, it's a kind of a comment. You are looking at Ada as a scholar. And of course, she is a scholar, and she would claim to be a secular scholar. But there was also another side to her whole involvement, and I believe that that's something important not to forget. I had a kind of a list of phone numbers of people, of many people that's wearing my Habad hat, involved with people in the Jewish community. When the Lubavitcher Rebbe became ill in 1992, he had a stroke. So the Chabad Women's Organization in London began phoning up people in the community, asking them to take on a mitzvah for the benefit of the Rebbe, that he should get better. And they said to me, can we have your phone book? I said, yes, it was a database. I said, sure, yeah. It didn't occur to me that Ada's number was also on this. And if I had realized that, I would have said, oh, don't phone Ada. But they did phone her. I don't know who exactly it was who phoned her. And they said, will you take on a mitzvah for the benefit of the health of the Rebbe? She said, well, what mitzvah? They said, well, maybe lighting Shabbat candles. She said, all right. And she actually lit Shabbat candles for those 2 years that the Rebbe was ill. And then he passed away and she stopped. But it's just an interesting facet to understand the fullness of what Ada really was in relation to Jewish thought, Jewish studies, Judaism, Jewish spirituality. Now, another little point in that is when the Rebbe passed away, I and several of my children immediately set off to go to New York, to be there for the Levaya, for the burial. And when we got to Heathrow Airport, there was a little bit of time, and I phoned Ada from the airport. She had already heard from someone who'd phoned her from New York. She knew the Rebbe was dead. She said to me, "Tali, what now?" I said to her, "The Rebbe's teachings will bring Mashiach." And she said, "That I can accept." So, you know, we are among the closest people to Ada. Of course, there's her children, but we who study her writings, maybe argue with her writings, and, you know, take her legacy forward. It's just a matter of understanding that dimension of her as well. So maybe Wojciech, you'd like to comment on that?
No, I mean, thank you so much. I mean, these two are amazing stories. I heard the second one. I haven't heard the first one. So this is the first time I hear it from you, which is, yeah, I don't, again, like I haven't gone through all the papers that we have here by Ada, but this is certainly an aspect of her, another aspect that it's not necessarily accessible through these papers, and as you said, through these lenses. So again, like, thank you for that, because absolutely this makes, I mean, this image wouldn't be full without that, wouldn't be complete without that.
Okay, does anyone else want to ask a question? Okay, well, I'll ask a question. So, I wanted to ask about the material from Show Shimon Deutsch. I noticed that in the pictures that you shared, there was handwriting on the covers, but I wasn't quick enough to to read it and listen. So I was wondering, were those, was she making notes about the content? And could you comment on, was she, you know, was she interested in the issue of succession and how this would play out? What do you think was her particular interest in looking at that, and what you know, what form did her research and her inquiries take?
Right. So I mean, first of all, they were posted directly to her from Brooklyn, so that's already an interesting thing that again shows this Ada's sort of connections, and that went beyond academia only. And yes, that's her handwriting. That's her handwriting, and she annotated some of these pamphlets, not all of them. Mostly, as far as I can tell, again, like I looked very briefly at these pamphlets. I was also interested in Shimon Deutsch's sermons. Like, it was the first time when I actually got access to that. So, and after hearing all those stories about this person, so that was also interesting to me. But as far as I can tell, Ada sort of underlined and commented a bit on several topical issues that he talked about in the sermons. I mean, all these sermons are, again, like, they are slightly different than sermons of other Chabad Rebbes, if I can say so. They're much shorter and much simpler in a way. So these are not, you know, those crystal palaces of Hasidic Kabbalah and philosophy and whatnot. They are usually, you know, 3, 4, 5 pages commenting on the parsha, and then usually, I mean, again, there's like 7 or 8 pamphlets here. I think we don't have I mean, in this collection, there's not. They're not all the pamphlets that he published. I know that the National Library of Israel has some some other issues as well. Like there are some that only they have. There are some that Ada had here. But then like he sort of diverged from the parsha itself and moves on to some topical issue. And I think the most interesting for Ada were questions of succession and his criticism of the Mashiachism. So there are one or two sermons where he very directly dismisses those Hasidim who believe that there's no place for electing electing a new Rebbe, and that is, in a way, trying to legitimize his position as the successor, the head of Anshe Yosna. So I think that was, Ada was less interested in the sort of textual interpretation on Deutsche textual interpretation, more on where he sort of either completely diverts from the parsha or uses the parsha in order to highlight, to polemicize actually with the mainstream Chabad community.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that. Let's move now to Naftali Loewenthal, who is a teaching fellow in the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at UCL and the director of the Chabad Research Unit. He's the author of Communicating the Infinite, the Emergence of the Chabad School, and more recently of Hasidism Beyond Modernity, Essays in Chabad History and Thought. And as we've already heard, he was a lifelong colleague of Ada Rapoport-Albert. Today, he will talk on the topic of women in Chabad Hasidism as explored by Ada Rapoport-Albert and other scholars.
Right, thank you. So, hold on. So now what I'd like to present is a kind of state of the field paper on research on women in Chabad, or to a certain extent, books emanating from or about women in Chabad. To do justice to this topic, it would have to be well beyond our time. So it's going to be a brief look at this very broad topic. Now, the role of Ada in this field is central, and I'll try to define it in relation to work that was influenced by her. But there's also a lot of work which precedes her or which seems independent of her. And my little attempt at a kind of a thesis here in this talk is that for scholars of music, women's studies, American studies, psychology, Lubavitch or sociology, Lubavitch women are sufficiently prominent for study to have taken place quite independent of Ada, without knowing her particular work on women in Hasidism or on Chabad. But within the study of Jewish intellectual history, the kind of history that most of us do based on careful analysis of texts, I personally feel it was Ada who opened the door to 20th century study. Although, in fact, there was such a paper before her as well, which will be mentioned. But the kind of, if you like, positive approach, I think Ada's role is crucial. Now let's start with her article, The Maid of Rubin on Women in Hasidism. Now here there's a massive material about the theme of the title, Women in Hasidism. And she presents this material, she orders it in such a way as to demonstrate that in fact women had no real role in Hasidism, and Horodetsky in his early 20th century writings was completely wrong in suggesting that women had an equal role in Hasidism, contrasting greatly as he saw it with their insignificant role in Talmud-focused Eastern European Jewish life. However, one can suggest, as I mentioned at a previous occasion, that using the same material, a quite different case could be presented. And this explains why when Nehemiah Pollack wrote an article countering her view. To a considerable extent, he used the material she herself had presented in her article. He didn't bring other material that she hadn't addressed. He brought material she had already mentioned, but he looked at it in a different way. Now, an important element in her article, which can be seen as running counter to the central thrust, is her treatment of women in Chabad. This is expressed in two long notes and notes. Note 83 and 84 at the end of her original article. A later version, the 2001 Hebrew edition of the article, had an extra section which was about the Maid of Lubne in the Holy Land. But the original article ends before that. Now, by the way, Ada said she learned the art of the long note from her beloved teacher, Joseph G. Weiss. In his own work, as of course in that of many other scholars, some of the most significant statements are in the notes, and Ada follows that. Now, when we look at the actual text of Ada's article about women in Hasidism, it ends with a clever twist so that, in a sense, the central theme of the women's secondary role in Hasidism is preserved. Although she's talking about Habad, the Habad emphasis on women's education in Jewish halachic thought and even Hasidic teachings, and on their participation in Chabad Lubavitcher activism, promotes the central rabbinic theme that men and women have entirely different roles. This thrust, quote, is based on stressing rather than obliterating the difference between men and women in Judaism. So even when at the end of her article she addresses Chabad, in the text, she says this actually is stressing the difference between men and women. Now, this having been said in the main text, strengthening rather than weakening its central thesis, the field is then open for Ada to veer aside from her central thesis in the final two notes. These express a very positive view of the woman's role in Chabad Hasidism, concluding with a quotation from a Lubavitch woman expressing her, quote, personal testimony in her article, Growing Up in Lubavitch, where this woman says, in Chabad, especially in terms of its outreach ethos, men and women enjoy, quote, equal roles. These are the last two words of the final note in the article, and in the original form of the article, that was actually the end of the article. Men and women have equal roles. Now, notice that that is completely at variance with what the article is basically saying. Now, interesting, in keeping with the theme of the article, the negative position of women in Hasidism, Note 83 begins with a strong critique of the effect of women in contemporary Jewish society by the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber. He saw women as contributing to the process of secularization. And in this note, Ada states it was his son, Rabbi Joseph Isaac, who, seeing the power of women to affect Jewish society, sought to reverse their role and transform them into positive activists on behalf of traditional Jewish observance for women, such as making them into campaigners for family purity, by which is meant the monthly use of the mikveh, and Chabad women were thus campaigning for Jewish women in general to positively fill the role ordained by Orthodox Jewish teaching. It's noteworthy that a later article by Ada sees the beginning of the women's constituency in Chabad, a generation earlier, in the time of Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber. So although in this footnote, she talks about the negative view that Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber had, in fact, there's a positive aspect relating to the role of women in Hasidism, which happens in his time, engineered by his wife, Shterna Sarah. Now, in note 83, we're looking at these two notes. In note 83, in her first article on women in Hasidism, she concludes with a few lines about Rabbi Nachum Mendel Schneerson, the seventh Rebbe, as regards to his activities relating to women. He, quote, he founded the Lubavitch Women's Organization and generated a vast literature for women, as well as numerous frameworks for women's activism all over the world. Now then the next note, 84, continues this thrust and provides more detail. It includes a partial list of Lubavitch publications extolling womanhood in Orthodox Jewish terms. There's a collection of Rabbi Menachem Schneerson's letters to the Lubavitch Women's Organization, published 1981, and other popular works published by the Chabad movement, 1976, A Woman of Valor, anthology for the thinking Jewess, edited and written in London. Another called The Modern Jewish Woman, A Unique Perspective, and Aura, a reader on Jewish womanhood, all engineered by the Chabad movement with the input by the Rebbe. Ada correctly states that these publications all emphasize the importance of the traditional Jewish view of fulfilled womanhood. The woman exemplifies the virtues of modesty, maternal responsibilities, and the creation of a proper Jewish atmosphere in the home. Now, it's interesting to note that while the first two virtues are stressed in traditional Jewish ethical literature addressed to women, the idea, so in other words, modesty and maternal responsibilities, but the third idea, that the woman is the key to the Jewish atmosphere in the home, is distinctly modernistic. It reflects the Lubavitch Rebbe's adaptation of a famous rabbinic phrase, Isha ksheira osa chatzon ba'ala, which in its original intent means a good woman fulfills the will of her husband, depicting a submissive and obedient wife. But the Rebbe transformed this phrase by providing an alternative translation of the same Hebrew words. A good woman, osa, makes the will of her husband. She influences his will and bends it in a spiritual and Orthodox Jewish direction. In that way, the Jewish atmosphere of the home indeed can be seen as depending on her. Other stress that stresses the subtle, that transformation is already there. And another point, which Ada stresses, and which is a very interesting link all the way through this literature, is the subtle and paradoxical link between the Lubavitch approach and feminism. She writes, aggressively appealing to women outside the Orthodox sector of Judaism, who have inevitably become exposed to feminism. The Lubavitch publications are quite ingenious in appropriating feminist concerns and terminology. For Ada, the initial surprising link between feminism and Orthodox Judaism had been made in an earlier article by Deborah Weissman, publishing in 1976 an article on Beis Yaakov, and which was based on Weissman's master's thesis. And I remember when that was when Ada found that, and she discussed it with me, and Weissman in fact sees Beis Yaakov in a kind of Orthodox Jewish feminist terms. Now, so other than maybe
somebody needs to mute themselves.
Now, so now Ada cites this, and this is this lengthy note, right? Weiss-style note. So an area of Orthodox Jewish life, which has provoked much modernistic and feminist criticism, is family purity. The idea that when the wife has a period, she and her husband do not unite physically till the blood flow has ceased, and then after a full 7 days, and then she dips in the ritual pool called the mikveh. Ada describes how the Lubavitch feminine literature utilizes feminist concepts such as, quote, a space for myself, in order to promote this practice. So there we have the idea that what for the one level of feminism is the most anti-women concept that you could imagine in Jewish thought, is somehow being utilized. Oh, it gives you a space for yourself, and that's a positive concept, and it drives with feminism. So so then we have she ends off the note as I mentioned before, ending with the idea that men and women have equal roles, with her quotation from this Lubavitch woman writing. Now, others' observations and her approach to the topic in these footnotes sparked further research on women in Chabad by others, including myself, Eli Rubin. Maybe I'm not quite sure if you would say that your research into women was sparked by her, but you certainly knew her and you knew about it when you were doing it. And so some of this will be discussed below. Now, at this point, I want to turn to things which were independent of Ada, preceding Ada, or if not preceding her, nonetheless independent. So let's look at Ellen Koskov, who wrote a dissertation about music in Lubavitch, with a chapter on the musical experience of a female Lubavitcher, which she completed in 1975, long before Ada's article in 1988. She saw her fieldwork in the Crown Heights Lubavitch community and its scholarly write-up in this dissertation, in particular in her chapter on women, as the point in which she entered the feminist literature of the day and its application to music. So it's interesting that she understood her work with the Lubavitch community as promoting her own relationship with feminism, and she certainly saw Lubavitch women as empowered, even though here we have another area of conflict. And Ellen Koskov describes it, that she's sitting at the Shabbat table and the husband begins singing and she starts singing with him, and the wife sitting next to her nudges her, shh, don't sing. And Ellen is completely upset by this. Well, what do you mean, don't sit? And the wife has to tell her, listen, women can't sing in front of men, you know. But despite that, that might have stopped her research then and there, but it didn't. And she found all kinds of creative forces among women and among men in her final write-up of the book, Music in Lubavitcher Life. Now, another scholar who had devoted herself to a research project on women in Lubavitch, independently of Ada, is Bonnie Morris. She undertook 1986 to 8, actually just when Ada was in Harvard, working on thinking through her approach to women in Judaism. So she'd undertaken this long research project, which was then published as Lubavitch Women in America, Identity and Activism in the Post-War Era. As a PhD, it was completed in 1989, and as a book, it came out 10 years later. Now, she trained as a historian, and she approached her subject as a historian, reading Chabad women's journals in a library in Crown Heights. But I think it's fair to see her work in the context of women's studies, and it's history, but it's not like Jewish history, you know, Jewish history with its textual analysis and exactly what is this, you know, this Hebrew phrase from 1850, does it mean this or does it mean that? That's not the kind of thing she was dealing with. She was reading Yiddish Heim, the Lubavitch women's publication, and other kinds of open text, and on the basis of that, she was writing. Another independent piece of research on Chabad women, published in 1988, this time in the field of psychology, was actually by my wife, Kate Miriam Loewenthal. She wrote an article, Patterns of Religious Development. Now, I can't remember how well Kate knew Ada at that stage. I knew Ada very well in the university, and there was a certain stage when Ada became part of our family, so to speak, and knowing my wife, our children, being at their weddings and so on, and meeting other friends of mine, like Rabbi Shmuel Lu. So I don't think that Patterns of Religious Development was actually influenced by Ada. It's just my wife's interest as a female psychologist, academic psychologist at that point, interviewing a number of women in the London Chabad community, including a descendant of a prominent Hasidic family, a woman who had an Orthodox upbringing and then chose to make the further step into Haredi Orthodoxy and Chabad, and a Balat Tshuva who moved from, so to speak, keeping nothing to full observance in the Chabad style. Now, there's a famous book, James Fowler, Stages of Faith, and I imagine that in that context, Kate presented different modes of religious development and two concepts which she developed in this article, which I've often found useful. There's the affirmer, who rejoices in the rules, the ideals, the rituals from the word go, and the resistor, who struggles with them and doesn't like them and eventually makes peace with them. And she found examples of this in her research. Now then we come to another figure who is also writing, Oive, who's also writing independently of Ada, and that is Wilensky. Now in 1985 at the 9th World Congress of Jewish Studies, he presented a paper on women in Hasidism, interesting. And his focus was on the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. And there he gave a completely negative perspective on the role of the women in Hasidism. And at the end of the paper, I said, what about Chabad? He said, oh, Chabad is different. Chabad is different. When the Rebbe writes to women, to the community, he writes El B'nai U'Benot Yisrael, to men, to the children, sons and daughters of Israel. So this sparked off in my thinking. So then we have the work that I was doing and work that others in terms of actual historical research. We then have another person who is actually independent of Ada, even though writing after her, is Stephanie Weller-Levine, who went to Crown Heights and for a year lived among girls who were mystics and others who were mavericks, who would go to a strip club with her, and merrymakers. And she was fascinated by these charismatic, empowered women. Then we and wrote a very interesting book about it. So then we have Eli and we have Wojciech, who have all also. So I'm just Eli has written a bit about women in Chabad in his extensive writings. Wojciech had a very interesting chapter in his thesis on gender in Rabbi Shneur Zalman's thought. But I will just conclude with two pieces by Ada. One I mentioned already, which is about the women's constituency beginning in the
Tali, you just muted yourself.
But the final article she wrote about Chabad is really a very interesting one, because it's spelling out the subtext of her first essay, that in Chabad it's different, from woman as Chassid to woman as Tzaddik. And there she takes detailed analysis of the teachings of the Rebbe and looking at the way in which he writes about that the whole world is sustained, Bishvil Chanina Bani, the world is sustained through my son Chanina, says the Talmud, and the early Hasidim said that is the Tzaddik. And the Rebbe then says that is the woman in the family, and every Jewish woman, they are bringing down this flow of spirit of divine life force into the world. So suddenly the Rebbe is presenting the woman as tzaddik, as having the role of tzaddik in the world. And that links in also with his messianic thrust, that it's women who have the particular power to bring the Messiah. Okay, so we've scratched a topic. Tzipi Kaufman should be mentioned and various others, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. Who wants to be the first to ask a question? Lily, go ahead.
Sorry, it wasn't a question. I was just applauding.
Oh, that was just okay. That was just applause. Okay. Anybody else want to ask something? No questions? Okay, well, I'll comment that you mentioned my writing about women in Chabad and asked whether I was in dialogue with Ada. And I think the answer is yes. It was very early on. It was one of the first pieces that I wrote when I started writing about Chabad history. And I had already read at least two of Ada's articles. By that stage, I don't think I'd read all her articles on women in Chabad. Some of them had not been published yet. But I had suddenly read the article Historiography with Footnotes, which at the end engages with the question of women in the literary writings of Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. And in the footnotes there's already, gestures to her other work. So I was suddenly aware and I was suddenly responding, and I sent it to her at the time. And she later cited it. So yes.
She was actually very enthusiastic about your article about Sonya Rosenblum.
Yes.
She was very struck by that. She talked to me about it, so she was very impressed with it. Yeah. And it it also opened up the whole question of the these very personal relationships that Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak had with various women, because I was at that time working on Chayasima Mikhailova, who was in Riga, and had this fascinating letter sent to her by Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. She had written saying, "What should I do about the emptiness of action?" And he responded with an incredibly profound meditation system, which recently I published this in Boron Yachad in honor of Nehemiah Poland. So I published a translation of the letter and discussion of it. But it's a very profound meditation system addressed to this young woman, young unmarried woman, a girl. And there's even a photograph of her available as an 18, 19-year-old girl. And that kind of relationship that Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak had with girls. When I visited Riga, I think it was in 1994, the rabbi there, Rabbi Kahn, who's since passed away, he told me that there were many girls that Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak would correspond with. And he spoke about a particular correspondent that there was a letter of 19 pages sent by Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak to this girl. Now, I don't know whether that letter is anywhere extant in his collected, published Igrot, but it was part of what Kahn was aware of in Riga.
Another thing that I would mention is, before I go to Martian, is that when Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak started publishing his own discourses, certainly the very first one, which was published also in Riga, it was, I'm not sure if it was written, translated, but by a woman. The name escapes me right now, but I did write about it in an article for Ingeweb when I wrote about the history of Yiddish and Yiddish publications in Chabad. And there I mentioned that this first discourse, I think 1929 in Riga, was published in Yiddish, in jargon, with an introduction in Hebrew. And it seems that this wasn't done by Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak himself. He had an editor, and it was a woman. Again, the name escapes me right now, but we can look it up. So Martian had a question, so let's go to Martian.
Actually, I have a comment more than a question, because I would like to add another dimension of what Ada did for study of women in Hasidism, which is, as we know, she was not only great scholar and writer, but also she was amazing reader and editor. And I would like to point to the fact that much what has been published, also, Natalie, you're saying independently, it was strongly influenced by Ada being the reader for most of the articles on women and Hasidism for the last 20 plus years, and in a significant part being editor of those volumes in which those articles appeared. And I was fortunately co-editor for 2 of those interesting articles, and I was an author of one of those articles that she edited. So I know it's as much of her as it is of me in those texts. And this is equally important, and it's very to me it's very significant how much she put of, actually not of her own ideas, but of her own criticism and her thoughts into increasing the value and making the articles more relevant for the wider community, and having it in the wider circle of scholarly debate. And that's how I don't think it's so much independent of Ada that was published in the last 30 years, because of her role either as just a cited author, but also in those other roles.
Absolutely, I agree. I would often hear her talking about her editorial work, and was also subject to it sometimes. But it always made me have the question about authorship, just as in Hasidic texts or things like that. There's the question of orthodox. Who actually wrote the text? Is it like now, Rabbi Yoel Kahn just passed away. So he actually was the person who wrote down the teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So is it the Lubavitcher Rebbe? Is it Yoel Kahn? I mean, it's the Rebbe, but Yoel Kahn certainly had a role. And Ada, I think, is like a co-author for everything that she edited. So certainly, I mean, she had a phenomenal effect on, I believe, on many areas of Jewish studies, and certainly on the study of women in Habad, as well as everything else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tali. Let's move now to our next presentation. We're going to hear now from Lily and Sonya. Lily Kahn is professor of Hebrew and Jewish languages at UCL. She is currently writing a grammar of 19th century Enlightenment Hebrew with Sonya Yampolskaya, and conducting an AHRC research project on contemporary Hasidic Yiddish around the world with her colleague Krista Esther Sizendroy at UCL Linguistics. She's author and co-author of several books, most recently Jewish Languages from A to Z. Sonya Yampolskaya is a research associate in the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at UCL. She completed a BA and MA at the St. Petersburg State University, followed by a second MA and PhD studies at the European University of St. Petersburg. Her doctoral thesis focused on linguistic and sociolinguistic features of European Hebrew development in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Today's presentation is titled A Linguistic Analysis of Joseph Perl's Megala Tamirin and Bochim Tzaddik, inspired by Ada Rapoport-Albert.
Thank you, Ellie. So Sonya is just going to share the presentation. And I just wanted to say, first of all, that it's been such a real delight and an honor to get to participate in this panel with so many of Ada's fellow PhD students and colleagues, and it's been really moving hearing about these different aspects of her legacy. So Sonya and I want to talk about another aspect of her legacy, which is her interest in language and linguistics. And it's completely due to Ada that I started going down this path and of like researching Hebrew and Yiddish in Eastern Europe. And not only did she always like kind of encourage and support this research, but she took an active interest in it. And so this just, I think, gives another illustration of how multifaceted her influence was. And, because this is something like, kind of history and gender studies is not usually something that you think of together with, you know, kind of grammatical analysis. But for Ada, this was just as natural as any other aspect of research on Jewish history and Jews in Eastern Europe. So the idea for this topic was Ada's. So when I was doing my PhD research and postdoc on Maskilic Hebrew and 19th century Hasidic Hebrew respectively, we were talking about Perl, because Perl always comes up. I think, Sonya, we can go on to the next slide. So we were talking about Perl because he always comes up, like, obviously in the context of the Haskalah, but also of Hasidism. And so because I was looking at the grammar of Maskilic Hebrew and then the grammar of contemporaneous Hasidic Hebrew, there's always this, you know, this is kind of the classic question that arises, like, well, Perl was a maskil, but he was writing Hasidic Hebrew, like a kind of parody of Hasidic Hebrew. And Ada said, I wonder what his language was actually like. People always say this was a parody of Hasidic Hebrew, but I wonder, like, whether that's actually true, and, like, you know, whether it was exaggerated. Maybe it wasn't really like the language that Hasidim wrote. And so this was kind of always sort of at the back of our minds. We said, we'll write a paper about this together someday. And of course, you know, being busy, there was never time. And then finally, when this conference was advertised, Sonya and I were working together on a grammar of Maskilic Hebrew by that point, and also on Hasidic Yiddish and contemporary Hasidic Hebrew. And so we suggested to Ada, like, what do you think? Shall we send this in and do this talk jointly? And so we originally submitted the proposal. It was going to be the three of us working on this together. And so then, you know, obviously Ada isn't, I wish that she was here to present it with us, but I mean, I know that she's here with us in spirit, and we're really honored to be able to, that we had the chance to look into this topic even without her, that this was really something that she was interested in and wanted to do. And so I'm really glad that we've got the chance to do it now. Although, you know, we really wish that she could be here with us. So this was the question, is like, Joseph Perl wrote these obviously among his many writings, he wrote these two satires of Hasidic texts. And so we wanted to look at what the actual language is like from a grammatical point of view. Is it like Maskilic Hebrew? Is it like Hasidic Hebrew? Okay, so sorry, Sonya, Carrie, go on.
Sure. Am I muted or not? Can you hear
No,
me?
we can hear you.
Okay, cool. So I just wanted to start with two more words of introduction. There are many things I loved so much in Ada, and among those was her a specific doubt about well accepted ideas, and this like kind skepticism. So this maybe this is this sort of emotion which is in the basis of our today's presentation. So for analyzing these texts by Perl, we had several counterparts to compare them with. And first of all, we compared the actual language as the linguists use this word. We compared this language in particular features with Maskilic Hebrew, and we are going to show you those features which are similar and others which are probably not, and also and we will discuss more in words features of Hasidic Hebrew. So the story behind it and the question is, we know this idea that Perl wrote these texts deliberately making many mistakes, grammatical or linguistic mistakes, so that these texts look like a proper Hasidic text. And we are going to address this general notion. So to start with, there is a very short list of common perceptions of Maskilic Hebrew, which is also different from the linguistic reality which you see when you really are reading and analyzing Maskilic texts. So first of all, it's believed that Maskilic Hebrew is very close to biblical stratum of Hebrew, which is far from being the true. That it grammatically conforms to standard biblical norms, which does describe it, but only very partially. The frequent use of biblical verbal constructions such as vayiktol and unprefixed infinitive construct. And also preference for biblical verbal forms such as infinitives construct with the first nun or yud. So I mean infinitives like lakachat, lada'at, latet, as opposed to their rabbinic equivalents liten, likach, lida, and so on. So this is something we expect in Maskilic texts. Preference for biblical particles such as ki asher and ka asher, as opposed to their rabbinic equivalents as she, mikivan she, kshe, and so on and so forth.
So similarly, there are some common perceptions that are generally held about Hasidic Hebrew from the same period. So the first one is that it's primarily based on the rabbinic stratum of Hebrew, so Mishnaic Hebrew, Talmudic Hebrew, as opposed to Maskilic Hebrew, which is, as Sonya mentioned, the idea is that it's primarily biblical. So there's immediately this idea that there's this huge gulf between Maskilic and Hasidic Hebrew, and that it's full of grammatical mistakes. So this is the thing that you always hear, and this is actually an idea that started with the Maskilim, and then it, kind of continued. It sort of was passed down into, kind of academic discourse and just sort of general ideas about this language. So there are things like non-standard noun gender, like where you'll have masculine nouns that are treated as feminine and vice versa, mismatches in definiteness discord between nouns and adjectives. And we'll see some examples. So if you're not if linguistics isn't your focus and this doesn't mean much, don't worry, because we'll see examples and then you'll see what we mean. Non-standard definiteness of construct chains. So things like habaligole instead of bal hagala. Subject verb gender and number discord, so where you have like haya with a feminine noun, that kind of thing, and many other like kind of features that separate it from Maskilic Hebrew. So the idea is, it's kind of traditionally assumed that if you were to look at a text, you would be able to see instantly from the language whether it's Hasidic or Maskilic, leaving alone the content. So other things like absence of typical biblical forms like the vayiktol, and use of characteristic rabbinic particles like she and mikivan she instead of their biblical counterparts, and then rabbinic verbal forms like liten, lidal, likach, like Sonya mentioned. So all of these kinds of things are kind of assumed to be characteristic of Hasidic Hebrew from the 19th century.
Okay. So looking at this picture, we assume that it's more correct and it's more precise to discuss not Maskilic Hebrew as opposed to Hasidic Hebrew, but to discuss the wider variety of Ashkenazic Hebrew, which includes both Maskilic and Hasidic, and there is not really much difference in terms of language between them. So what are those, again, a very short list of those mutual features, common features. So both Maskilic and Hasidic Hebrew exhibit the following characteristics: both biblical and rabbinic features, non-standard noun morphology, and you will see it a lot in the presentation, non-standard noun gender, noun adjective difference discord, and so on, and biblical and rabbinic infinitives and biblical and rabbinic particles, and other smaller, more and less significant features. These resemblances are not surprising given the shared East European background of Maskilic and Hasidic writers, and we argue that Maskilic and Hasidic literature are both components of a wide Ashkenazic variety of Hebrew. This actually mirrors the talks we heard today earlier on how Hasidim actually read Maskilic literature and vice versa, of course. And so there are ideological differences, and struggles and so on, which we perceive as rigid, but they actually do not reflect actual linguistic differences, or not very much.
So if we look at Perel's anti-Hasidic satires in light of these considerations, you would kind of expect, based on the the commonly assumed narrative, is that his satires would have been intentionally written in a Hasidic linguistic style as opposed to a Maskilic style. So if readers point to something like non-standard noun gender or definiteness discord in Perel's text, they'll say, he did that on purpose to kind of portray the sort of like corrupt Hasidic language. But actually, because Maskilic and Hasidic texts are in reality linguistically pretty much the same, very, very, very similar, and they both share these features, it's very difficult to say whether or not Perel was doing any, like, how can you say this is a Hasidic feature, this is a Maskilic feature, because most of those features were actually shared. And so we're going to show you some examples of how, when you look at the, kind of all of the characteristic linguistic features of Perel's writing, in most cases, it's very difficult to say, you can't say, oh, he was doing this on purpose to make it look Hasidic, because you can find exactly those same features everywhere in Maskilic writing. It's just that they're not famous for that. They're the kind of, sort of stereotypical narrative is that they're very biblicizing, but actually, in fact, they're really not. They have all these same features. So we're going to take a look at some of the most prominent of these features now.
So first, we'll discuss articles and they use. In yellow tables, you see parts of Perel's text, and in gray, you see Maskilic examples from Maskilic texts. So the first feature is very famous and like visible and simple, the retention of definite article after preposition. So like le habait with a hair written instead of labait as it is a rule in contemporary modern Hebrew and as it was used in biblical Hebrew. So Hesse is a very clear feature of Ashkenazis, of Ashkenazic Hebrew. Here are examples from the Perel's text. Amarti leraarender leavtiach leasar shelo limtso meod. Or behagdama lasefer aniskar lal. And so on. And in Maskilic text, you can find it all over, whether they are articles, fiction, non-fiction, everywhere you can see the same feature. Be'asefer, le'abait, it's very typical for Maskilic texts too. The second feature is when we have a construct and both nouns are accepted as one word. So in those cases, article is prefixed before the first noun. So ha yain saraf, or ha chetichot niyar, ha agamat nefesh, and so on. And this is also a very typical feature for Maskilic Hebrew. Ha bate sefer harishonim, ha anshe tzava, and so on and so forth. So it was the same. It was very typical for both Maskilic and Hasidic, so we cannot say whether it was done deliberately or not. I guess that not. The other point is that when a contemporary reader takes Perel's text with knowledge of contemporary modern Hebrew, with these perspective, it might look like a severe mistakes, but actually these were just a very common features of that type of Hebrew, of that variety. So this is an interesting phenomenon. When we have a noun and an adjective, and the article goes in between them. So we don't have an article before the noun, but we have it before the adjective. For example, mizmanim hakodmim, Shabbos Kodesh Abo, Shabbat HaKadosh Haba, and so on. In Maskilic Hebrew, they use that a lot, specifically in science literature discussing different animals or geography or stars, and among other things, among other functions, that was used to as a marker of a specific concept. And here we have one example, Chag Anaim Azeh, but there was also Kof Ashachor, for example, as a black monkey, as a specific type of monkeys. So this is a common feature for both Pearl's text and Maskilic text too. Now split construct chains.
So we're giving Maskilic examples here because all of these features are features that are seen as like kind of non-standard and are perhaps expected to be found in Hasidic texts. So we just wanted to show you the contrast that you find them, all of these features in Hasidic texts, apart from Peril, but you find them just as much as in Maskilic Hebrew as well. So another one is split construct chain. So there's this rule in biblical Hebrew, this is kind of the standard, and in other canonical forms of Hebrew and in modern Hebrew, that you're not supposed to put anything between a construct noun and its absolute counterpart. So Vav shouldn't go between two construct nouns, but you see it all over in Peril's writing, as you can see from these examples, like Minichbadei v'chashuvei ha'am, or Kol Yesod u'Vinyan Hakat, Be'ezrat u'V'schut Rabbeinu HaKadosh, etc. And again, you find this a lot in Maskilic Hebrew. So if this is a non-standard feature, it's not a non-standard feature of Hasidic Hebrew or kind of mocking Hasidic language. It's just a standard feature of Ashkenazic Hebrew, which Peril likely didn't even think about. Another feature which is really widespread in Hasidic texts and also in Peril and also in Maskilic Hebrew is the treatment of nouns ending in ut as masculine. So this we think is likely due to the fact that in the Ashkenazic pronunciation, these would have been pronounced as s, and a lot of these nouns exist in Yiddish, and in Yiddish they don't have an association with feminine gender. So if you're like kind of thinking of the nouns that you would typically expect to be feminine, they'll end in kametz hey, like kala, kale, isha, ishe, etc. And so anything ending in e is typically associated with feminine nominal gender in Maskilic Hebrew, and in Hasidic Hebrew and in Peril. So ha'ot hagadol, bizrizut gadol, etc. And then you get the same thing in Maskilic Hebrew. So another feature that we get is the vayiktol. So we mentioned that this is considered to be a characteristic feature of Maskilic Hebrew in narratives, but actually you get this like kind of typically biblical form. But you get this a lot in Peril, and you get it a lot in Hasidic writing as well as in Maskilic writing. So vayikra, vayishtomem, vayischak, vayomer, etc. So you can't really use the vayiktol, as is often assumed, to distinguish a Maskilic text from a Hasidic text. Okay. Then another form that we get a lot is there's this kind of paraphrastic verbal construction where you have having two separate parts, haya plus a katal plus a perfect. So like haya lo hayta ratzta, hayiti kvar yadati, as it functioning as a kind of past tense or as a pluperfect tense, or sometimes in conditional clauses. And this is like kind of non-standard. You don't get this in the canonical forms of Hebrew or in modern Hebrew. It's possibly is influenced by Yiddish and also by medieval Hebrew translated from Arabic or written under Arabic influence, has a similar construction used as a pluperfect. But you get it in Hasidic writing, in Peril, and also in Maskilic writing. Okay. And then a little bit more on verbs before we come to the last couple of points. So we mentioned at the beginning these rabbinic style infinitive construct of first Yud and first Nun root classes.
I think Lily is muted. Can you hear me? You cannot hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Sonya, but Lily seems to be frozen.
Yes, we actually thought that that might happen. I will talk about this particular slide and maybe several slides after that, and we will wait until it comes back. So these are examples of rabbinic style of infinitives. We used to see, if we are speakers of modern Israeli Hebrew, we used to see infinitives like latet, lada'at, lashevet, lalechet, and so on. So Pearls uses a lot of rabbinic infinitives like lida, liten, likach, lishev, lisa. And again, you might think that this is a feature of specific Hasidic language, or that this is the way how Pearl mocks Hasidic language. But at the same time, in Maskilic Hebrew, there are plenty of such infinitives, and maybe 50-50. So there are a lot of them. You cannot distinguish these. This feature cannot serve as something to distinguish Pearl's text, Hasidic text, or Maskilic text. It's just a common feature of a general Ashkenazic writing. There are some odd things with one particular verb, likro, which usually we used to see with aleph, right? Kuf reish aleph. Likro, to read, and we can find forms likrot without aleph, as with the other verb likrot, to happen, right? Which is kuf reish hey. So the verb with aleph, to read, is used sometimes according to the model of a different verb with third hey. But the examples clearly show that this is the meaning of to read. Itchalti likrot igeret shelcha. I started to read your letter. Kariti igeret shelcha. This is what we find in Pearl, and at the same time, we can easily find specifically these kind of forms in Maskilic press. A lot of those. Kariti basefer taldot bnei hodu. It's not a problem. Again, you might think that this is a feature or this is a deliberate mistake, but it is not. One more specific rabbinic feature is the ending in, with the same meaning as im for masculine or plural. Mechashvin, yecholin, specifically with the word yechol. It's very yeah, you can see it a lot, and the same thing is Maskilic Hebrew too. It might be a bit boring because we are like each and every slide we are trying to defend and to show the same thing, but it won't be as as boring until the end of the presentation. So here,
sorry, Sonia, I'm back.
Oh, great.
I lost internet, but I'm back now. So okay, thank you. Sorry, everyone. So this is another one that is actually associated with Maskilic Hebrew, but you find in Hasidic texts and in Pearl as well. So it's the use of a biblical infinitive, so biblical infinitive construct without lamed, being used as a temporal construction. So like b'shom'i, when I heard, b'vo'i, be'yoti, be'omram, etc. So this is like characteristically biblical and is not found in rabbinic literature. And you see it in Maskilic writing and in Pearl's writing and in Hasidic writing.
Okay, this is a nice thing. Subject verb disagreement. Sometimes when we have verb at the beginning and the subject goes after the verb, there is disagreement, meaning that the verb is in masculine singular while the subject might be in feminine or even in plural. The first example, haya li zchiya. Zchiya obviously is feminine, right? But there is a haya, masculine. The second example, haya lanu nekama. Even inside Ashkenazic rules of gender of nouns, nekoma is always feminine. So, but the verb yiyeh is in masculine. In the third example, we can see the disagreement in number. Haya lanu asakim. Yeh sha'at aya halvana. And the same thing is found in Maskilic Hebrew. For example, haya li yigi'a. Again, a very clearly feminine noun, which is a subject and a masculine form in the beginning. So it is typically happen when the verb haya is in the beginning before the subject. My feeling about Pearl's text specifically is that Pearl uses it not from time to time, but as a rule. So always, or almost always, when there is the verb liot in the beginning, there is disagreement in gender and number. So he might exaggerate this feature to show the specific folk style of his text, to this like low style, low Hebrew, as opposed to very correct biblical. This is might happen, but no one can be sure. The next feature is omission of at, of the marker of accusative. If there is a verb and there is an object with the article, we used to see at. Izkarta lo Hashem, no at, but theoretically it should be there. Ganvu kol asfarim instead of ganvu et kol asfarim, and so on. And this is a very typical, again, and common feature in Maskilic Hebrew. And it seems that in Ashkenazis, there was now an idea that at is compulsory in these cases. You might use it if you want, you might not. It was not such a rigid rule as it is now in modern Israeli Hebrew. The next 3 slides are about specific loan words and specific levels of lexis in Pearl's writings. So we can find a lot of Aramaic, Slavic, and Yiddish words. For Aramaic, we specifically decided to show them because the Aramaic usually marks a very high type of language. So this is something you might think that if Pearl mocks the non-educated style of speech, there won't be a lot of Aramaic expressions, but there are a lot. And again, in Maskilic Hebrew, you can find a lot of those too. The Slavic component, it was a bit difficult to show. So those Slavic words we show here are those which are not 100%, but 90% are Slavic, and they are not used much in Yiddish, because the majority of Slavic words used in Ashkenazic Hebrew was used in Yiddish too. So in this case, we count them as Yiddish words. So here, let's see several nice words. Lekhu et goya pitom al hadopros. So they took the non-Jewish woman suddenly for an interrogation. Nadapros. Shnei yamim olech pocht mipo. The mail goes 2 days from there. So pocht, like pochta. In the third example, we have sledstve, which is sledstve, I guess. In the fourth, there is zasidatelь. Then there is gorodnichi, and the last one I like because he uses this expression a lot, al-chai, lalechet lemishu al-chai, or liot etzel mishu al-chai, so which means to visit someone to drink tea, and which is a very nice loan phrase, so to say, from Slavic languages. And obviously you have a lot of Slavic words in Maskilic Hebrew. There is slight difference in style. So I would say that in Maskilic Hebrew, majority of Slavic lexis, they are from formal and high register. And in Pearl's text, they are from different register, a lot of them, like to lalechet lemishu al-chai. So they are taken from colloquial Slavic registers, not from formal written high genres. And sure, there are a lot of Yiddish words. to start with the word buch and with the plural bicher, with the Yiddish plural bicher used in Hebrew text, which is a key word for the whole story of the book, because rabbis are looking for a book written by Pearl. And as far as this is not a holy book, this is opposite, it cannot be called with the word sefer or sefer. It might be only a buch or bich, and bicher is the plural. So there are various Yiddish loan words. Again, many of those are from colloquial style and like lore genres. You can see that. So there is lulke and tzibuk. So again, like tzibuk, this is originally a Turkish word, but we assume that it came then to Ukrainian and then to Yiddish. So that's why here it's in the Yiddish slide. There is shlumazelnik, there is katoves, barilki, pacheli, kvit, grenets, doctor, butelki yain, and so on. So you can see, according to the context, there is natnu bito alif butelki yain. This is one register of discussion, and in Maskilic text you'd see more formal register and scientific, sort of popular scientific register for Slavic, for Yiddish words too. So the last slide, there are several features, really a short list of those, which are found in prose text and are not typical. They are not typical, not either for Maskilic or for Hasidic texts. So that there is some sort of mismatch. In the first example, there are atnuot ametukim, and there is no reason in Ashkenazic Hebrew why tnuot would be feminine, would be masculine. Sorry, because this is tnu'eh, right? And there is mismatch in person too. There are several examples, atem einam instead of atem einechem, right? Atem second plural, einam third plural. The best example is the last one, I think, ani haya. So there is break of rules, of accepted norms about person, and this is something I haven't seen, to be honest, in Maskilic or Hasidic writings. So we are approaching conclusions. Lily?
Thanks. Sorry, my internet keeps dropping today. So just very, very quickly, our basic points are that almost all of the non-standard grammatical features that Perl uses are also characteristic not only of Hasidic Hebrew, but of Maskilic Hebrew as well. And it's not like he uses them in an exaggerated way. He uses them in pretty much the same way that you would see in a Maskilic text. And as we've said, we think that this is due to the fact that in actuality, Hasidic and Maskilic Hebrew are very, very similar linguistically. And they both comprise part of a kind of broader Ashkenazic form of Hebrew that has all of these features. So one thing that we haven't done is compare Perl's writing in these satires to his other writings that are not intended to be satirical, to see if there's any difference. But if you just compare these writings on their own to Maskilic writings, you will not find really any linguistic differences except possibly some of the ones that Sonya mentioned. Okay, so very quickly, last slide. Sorry, we know we've gone a bit over.
I will just add several words that it is also possible that in early Haskalah, the belief that Maskilim are writing in sort of a biblical style of Hebrew was stronger, because if we and then in the late 19th century this belief was much weaker, and there was much more acknowledgement of rabbinic elements involved. For example, we showed you examples with the verb haya in the beginning, and when there is mismatch in gender and number, and this construction is particularly typical for the writings of Abramovich, who is like one of the most authoritative Hebrew writers of late Haskalah, and he used this construction a lot. So there is also possibility that the feelings of the audience and of the readers as well about style, they actually went through some changes from the beginning of the 19th century until the end. I think that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. We're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The floor is open. Does anyone, is Marcin asking? Marcin, do you have your hand up?
Yes. I would like to make a comment. First of all, I would like to thank for this fascinating speech. It's very much refreshing, and the conclusions seem to me very important for understanding. They're actually, in a sense, revolutionary, because you reevaluate everything that we knew about Pearl and his writing so far. And this is, as I understand, that you are implying that his writings on the linguistic plane are neutral, and this is not a parody of language, but that we juxtapose the parody of social relations presented in the text on the parody of language, which I think is fascinating to understand this individual case of text. But I would like to push you a bit further with your analysis, because you did excellent linguistic analysis on the level of lexical analysis and morphological analysis. You included some elements of the stylistic analysis, but you didn't do semantic analysis so much. And so my question is, if we use the tools of of ethnosemantics, if we ask about the coloring of the word that he's presenting, is there any difference? And I'm not speaking about Pearl himself, but more broadly, can we apply tools of ethnosemantics on division within Hebrew? Can we speak about different substrata of this language at that time? Can we say that those two languages, as we assume so far, right, with differences between Hasidic and Maskilic language, can we assume that those are two different linguistic systems on the level of semantics?
Do you want to start, Sonya, or shall I?
No, please start.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think so semantic, neither of us are semanticists. So this it goes a bit beyond what we would normally look at, because this is I guess something a bit more like philosophy of language, or
what I mean is more like cultural linguistic, and asking about, the most classical issues of the meaning of colors, like how the colors are defined. That's the classical, but of course it goes further. You indicated some problems, you say, with gender, but does it lead us to rethink different categories of the gender vision of the word, or maybe not, or maybe it's just on the level of language?
It's just on the level of language. This is I think it's it's phonologically motivated. So it's what the ending of the word, which sound the word has at the ending. It's nothing to do with meaning in that respect. The grammatical stuff is not there's no difference between the Hasidic and the Maskilic in terms of meaning. So it would really be on the lexical level, I think, in terms of meanings of particular words, which is something beyond. I don't think so, except for maybe in specific terms, if there's a specific term that means something in Hasidus that, that has a different meaning, say, I don't know, oilim, for example, or, if there are specific terms that have a function in Hasidic circles that don't have that function outside of them, maybe, but then that's kind of not really linguistic. It's more the content and the use of specific terminology rather than a general, so there's nothing that we noticed. He was talking about, kind of all kinds of topics that you wouldn't see those exact topics in Maskilic text, but you would see probably most of the individual vocabulary items, I guess. So Sonya, do you want to add anything?
If I may. So I think the difference is the same as, or similar to, there was this, we discussed in the very beginning of this day, today, the difference between Trumpists and anti-Trumpists. So I think if we can say that Trumpists and anti-Trumpists have different language varieties, then we might try to apply it to Maskilic and Hasidic, or to prose text and Maskilic text, but not in a larger extent. There are several words which are key, and they have different, they have specifically different meanings like Buch Bicher, which is inside Hasidic culture, there is this pair of Buch and Sefer, and this is important. This is why this is important. In Maskilic Hebrew, they don't tend to have this division. But I don't think it makes us talking about two different varieties. But again, this is the question: what are varieties, and how do we understand this concept? I think so. I just wanted to add one more thing. Martin, you said again early today that we need a databases of Maskilic and maybe Hasidic letters too. This would be my dream. I would really love to have one and to be able to use one. If there is anything we can do for this, that would be great.
As I say, we are, I mean, it's the Galisa and his team that are trying to make the corpus of all Hasidic stories, which will be 15,000 stories, which will be amazing resource for your analysis, I believe, among others, because you have all of them in one place that you'll be able to look for individual grammatical forms, but also for the words adjusting. You'll be able to look for strings of words and many more issues. I don't know of any attempt to create such a corpus for Maskilic text so far, but I think this is a big desideratum that still is ahead of us. And all the research that we've heard today, and I assume we'll be hearing tomorrow too, about so-called Maskilic library, which is today a major topic of research. What Rachel was saying, right? If we think what makes the Maskilic library, we are still at the very beginning of this research exactly because we don't have a corpus. We are unable to do the proper research on this as a corpus and not on individual cases. So Sonia, I'm fully with you, and I hope one day it will come, rather sooner than later.
Amen.
Okay, Sophie Korn has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. When did the preconceptions appear? Did the Maskilians 19th century already have them?
Yeah, the Maskilium. So a lot of this comes, I mean, this all kind of originates with Maskilic ideas, because ideologically the Maskilium were, very opposed to the Hasidim culturally, and they kind of also, there's this sort of stereotype that arose of Hasidic writers sort of having very bad command of Hebrew and not knowing Hebrew grammar, because Hebrew grammar, as conceived of in the, kind of the Maskilic idea, was that, which was quite groundbreaking, was for the first time that you'd study biblical grammar, like they would study, Genesius Hebrew grammar, and they were very interested in grammar, and this was something that set them apart from the kind of traditional Jewish approach to education, which did not involve the study of grammar in Central and Eastern Europe prior to the Haskalah. So this was like a big sticking point, and it's very interesting that they had these ideas, but actually their own writing did not support these ideas. This idea that you're the stereotype that they were supposed to write biblicizing, like very biblical Hebrew, and then a lot of these ideas filtered through into the early years of the revernacularization project in Palestine, because many former Maskilim became early Zionists and settled in Palestine, like Ben Yehuda, for example. He started off, like his first writings were in Maskilic Journal, and many others. So it kind of filtered through into the sort of language planning discourse, this idea that there are right and wrong forms that are based primarily on biblical standards. And so in the early decades of modern Hebrew, Yael Reshef and Einat Gonen have done a lot of work on this. It's very interesting because you find a lot of these same features that we've found from the 18th and 19th centuries in Eastern Europe. You find them in in writings from Palestine in the 20s and 30s, and they're criticized as being wrong. So clearly, we think these are features that were very, very widespread all through Central and Eastern Europe that were used by Hasidim and Maskilim, and other writers, like the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is full of the same types of features as well, and that's neither Hasidic nor Maskilic. And other writings as well, like the Hanover, Nataneta Hanover, the like kind of narrative about the Khmelnytsky pogroms, which is from the 17th century, also has these same features. And so basically, there is kind of no such, this divide didn't really exist, but the masculine kind of started this idea, and then it was perpetuated, and it kind of goes now all the way into the present day. There's still this idea that, like, say in modern Hebrew, that using feminine numbers with masculine nouns is wrong or a mistake, but actually you find this all the way in Ashkenazic Hebrew and in the early years. So there are all kinds of features, like many of the ones that we discussed. But so it's kind of become embedded in the like standard discourse. That was probably too long of an answer, but like, yes, it started with the masculine and then it spread.
What about rhetoric devices? Because Trumpists and anti-Trumpists probably speak the same English, but they use different connotations and different rhetoric devices. Did Perel mock Hasidic Hebrew in that level?
Oh yeah, of course. Yes, this level is clearly presented.
And on the level of content, like definitely, but just in terms of the kind of actual language, no, but yeah, in terms of the style and like kind of what he's describing, like the content, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a very wonderful discussion. I would also like to ask one question, and that is, in the examples that you showed, you showed examples of Maskilic texts drawn from I think periodicals, and the example of Joseph Pearl's own writings, his satirical writings. We didn't show examples of the corresponding material in Hasidic texts, and I assume that you were using, that was part of the comparisons also. And my question is, what did you use? Did you use Lily's material, which she worked on, Hebrew stories, or what about, would we see differences in different genres of Hasidic writing itself? If you're writing something, and maybe this is true in general of rabbinic writing, that there are different genres where you would see different levels of grammatical usage, or different forms of using Yiddish words, for example, or not using Yiddish words. If you're writing a more formal letter to an elite rabbinic person, you're going to write at a higher level, and then if you're writing something more formal like a story, there's going to be obviously differences. So yeah.
So I say, Sonya, or do you? Okay, so yeah, so the reason that we didn't bring examples from the Hasidic text was because, mainly just because we didn't want the slides to be like too packed. And in most cases, the features that we're showing are the kinds of features that are like kind of expected of Hasidic text. So those we thought it's kind of not, like we don't need to show them, because the assumption would be that this is what Perel is mocking, is this kind of writing, that he's doing this on purpose to mimic Hasidic, what you would find in Hasidic texts. So we really wanted to emphasize the fact that, like, look, you find all of these same features, at a very high rate in Maskilic texts as well. But yeah, so like ideally, and if we turn this into a paper, then we'll put in the examples from the Hasidic text as well. So for the Hasidic text, we were basing it on narrative, because that's like the closest, so the Hasidic tales like Shivchei Arav and the Menachem Mendel Boydek, and like all of that corpus, what I use for the Hasidic grammar. So the Shivchei Besht and the Nachman stories, Rabbi Nachman, but mostly the corpus from like the kind of 1850s onwards, because there's so much more of it. So there's like, and it's a bit, and the same with the Maskilic writing as well, is that we try to like kind of show some examples from the whole range of the Maskilic era, but because there's so much more from the later period with the Maskilic and the Hasidic texts, is that like Perel was actually relatively early when he was writing, especially Megalit Mirin. It was like, the Galilean Haskalah, there wasn't the abundance of writing on either the Maskilic or the Hasidic side that there was later. But the features that we've described are features that you can see even like in the late 18th century, but we didn't use like the drashas or the like speculative writing, because we think like in terms of genre, it's much closer these satires are much closer to the narrative literature. So yeah, but you're right that in terms of genre that you'd see, like, for example, if it's like a drasha or it's something that doesn't have past narrative, then you won't see the vayiktol in any kind of writing in Maskilic, or, you know, like if it's not something that has a past tense element, then there will be no vayiktol. So yeah, we thought that the narrative is kind of closest to this genre. And also in terms of the lexis, it's pretty similar to what you get in the Hasidic tales and in Maskilic, all kinds of writing, really, the press and novels. And Sonia, did you want to add anything? Right?
No, I think that's clearly so, yeah.
Okay, I see Talia is raising his hand.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. But I'm reminded of a paper that Zev Gries gave at UCL many, many years ago, talking about Hasidim, Mitnagdim, that I don't think he was talking about Maskilim, he was talking about Hasidim, Mitnagdim, that most areas of their lives were exactly the same. The Beit, you know, the Cheder, the children went to, the yeshiva, they went, it was all exactly the same. The fact that someone was, you know, spiritually drawn to be a Hasid, or someone was virulently against the Hasidim, made absolutely no difference to the language they spoke. And, you know, and I think the Maskilim as well, most of the Maskilim went to exactly the same Cheder. You know, had an education which was not going, you know, it was not going to be a different education. And so, in fact, the idea that there should be differences is itself very surprising and intriguing, that the Maskilim should start thinking that there are differences.
Yes, absolutely right.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, to me, this raises like the question of kind of code switching, which we see today. When you move from one community to another, or interacting in different social spaces, there are different lexicons, different grammatical usages that occur. I mean, even in just a contemporary from community, you know, between modern Orthodox, Habad, or other Hasidic groups, there will be a lot of code switching. But that might be a much more modern phenomenon. But it's interesting to think about the development of that and how that might play into your work and to the analysis.
Well, this is an amazing question, actually. The problem is that the term code switching was introduced after this period. And we have now, I mean, the only way to really study code switching, you need recordings of spontaneous speech. And this is something we do not have from the 19th century or earlier. At the same time, I'm sure that code switching is a very natural thing which people did for like all their history, especially like in multilingual communities. Monolingual communities are a rare phenomenon, but in multilingual communities, code switching, it looks like something very natural. I don't think, why would it be a novelty in the 20th century, to be honest?
Right, so that might answer part of Tali's question as to why they thought there would be differences in writing as well. If there were differences in general speech, you know, moving from one space to another, say from the market to the base measures, the Chassidische base measures to the Nostalgische shul. So maybe they just assumed that would be reflected in writing as well. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe.
All right, well, this is great. This is a really fascinating discussion and a really great panel. I think it really helped us to see the breadth of Ada's legacy and how fruitful continuing to engage with her is and will continue to be. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ellie. Lovely seeing everyone.
Thank you, Ellie. just a few words so first of all, that was an amazing, great memorial panel. So thank you so much. Thank you, Lily, for helping us to organize this panel. Thanks, Sally, for moderating it, for your questions. Thanks, Sonya, Naftali, and Wojciech, and Lily again for your great presentations. I just want to add that we also remember Ada as a very bright and helpful person. She was helpful to Ukrainian Jewish studies, and for last years before her passing away, she served as a member of the editorial board of Judaico-Ukrainica, our journal, our association's journal. So thanks a lot, colleagues.